Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's TEFL Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris, and the topic of today's masterclass is AI and pronunciation. Hype or hope? So I've divided today's workshop into the four main sections that you can see on screen. I want to begin by actually considering what does it mean to teach and to learn the pronunciation of English inside and outside the classroom. And I then want to introduce, and this is something I feel passionately about, the importance of a principled approach to teaching pronunciation, which I think informs all of my teaching, not just pronunciation, but everything. And then for the major part of the session, I want to address this question of, is generative AI hype or hope for our classrooms? And I'll then at the end draw some conclusions. So by attending today's session, in terms of your learning outcomes, I think there are four main ones. We'll look briefly in the first section at a review of the challenges of teaching pronunciation before moving on in part two, that you will have considered some of the key principles, at least as I can believe in them, for pronunciation development. Then in the larger part of the masterclass, together we will review AI tools and in particular look at the application of those principles in deciding whether a particular tool is or is not suitable for pronunciation development work, either in the classroom or for self-study, before in number four discussing and reaching those conclusions about the hype or hope of generative AI. So with that in mind, let's make a start. And to do that, I just wanted very briefly to share a little bit of my history of both teaching pronunciation, but also my response to being asked to run this masterclass, because the two are very similar. Fact is, when I was asked, would I lead this masterclass, I almost said no. Much in the same way that in my career, both as a teacher and a teacher trainer, I've been rather nervous, or certainly earlier on in my career, was rather nervous about teaching pronunciation. This all started when I just found it all a bit complicated and difficult back in the very early days when I trained in 1993. And even after further studies at the end of the last century, makes me feel a bit old, for my diploma, I still felt a bit nervous of pronunciation. I became a teacher trainer about 20 years ago and then worked on CELT programs 10 years ago. But it wasn't really until 2019 that I started to feel more comfortable with teaching pronunciation on teacher qualification programs. And I think that sort of not wanting to teach, trying to dodge the bullet of teaching pronunciation, was kind of in the background when asked to do this session. However, the fact of the reality is that, as I've argued passionately in other gallery teachers' masterclasses, that AI is something we can't and shouldn't avoid. I thought it was only right that I applied that to myself and that I should seize the day and start researching this topic. And although I am still a little bit nervous and I don't necessarily consider myself as a world expert, compared with real AI experts like Lana, a great friend of gallery teachers, nevertheless, I think the fact that I am confident in my teaching and in my teaching of pronunciation, that the two together will enable me to share something of hopefully some value and use to all of you. So let's make a start with this first section. And what I'd like to do in the first part of the masterclass is to look briefly with you at what it means, or at least what it should mean, to teach English language pronunciation. I'm then going to consider some of the challenges that exist, but also reflect on some of the opportunities that our media-rich world offers us and weren't available, say, 20, 30, or maybe even 10 years ago. So for me, when it comes to teaching pronunciation, there are certain wish list elements that I have. So the first one is that I think when we teach pronunciation and when we teach language, English in this case, it should always be within the context of enabling learners communication. We're not teaching them grammar facts for the sake of it or facts about pronunciation. We're teaching them to use the language to communicate. And within the context of communication, that means enabling them to be, I think, intelligible to one another. That leads us on nicely to the next second bullet point, that pronunciation, teaching and learning is about intelligible communication. This is, I think, one of the big shifts, that no longer is pronunciation teaching seen solely as about production, what we say, but it's also about what we hear and how we understand it, being able to decode the stream of sounds at an individual sound level and at a stretch of sound level, the segmental and the suprasegmental levels. I also believe passionately that what students have access to in the classroom in terms of L2 English exposure just isn't enough. They need to have lots of exposure inside and outside the classroom. The classroom gives them explicit exposure, but they also need implicit exposure, which does beg the question, what variety of English or what varieties of English are they going to be exposed to? And then finally, when it comes to pronunciation teaching, I believe it should be integrated. So, for example, when we are looking at the modal verb can for ability, that we integrate into the question, the negative and the positive form, can you? Yes, I can. No, I can't. That we look at some of the features of pronunciation. And you'll notice there, for example, the change in the vowel length. Now, we don't want students to be able to talk about vowel length and how it changes from yes, I can, I can't in the negative, but we actually want them to be able to use it and to distinguish it for meaning when they hear it, talking to their friends and other people about their abilities. Now, of course, I'm not wanting to suggest that teaching pronunciation is necessarily particularly easy. I think for many teachers around the world, and here I put us all in the same boat, whether you happen to have been born as a native speaker or as a non-native speaker, I think a lot of teachers found pronunciation both complicated and scary. For many teachers, there is a fear that they don't really know enough about it. And that can lead to issues about not just, do I know enough about pronunciation? Do I know enough about how to teach pronunciation? But can I therefore be confident in helping my learners to improve? Plus, of course, in some cases, there is the influence of the teacher's own L1. And let's remember that's for native speakers as well. I happen to have a relatively standard RP accent, the kind of things that you might see in many dictionaries or course books, traditional course books. But if you come from the north of England and you say things like grass and bath rather than grass and bath, is that an interference? Is that somehow showing learners a variation of English that is somehow less privileged? I mean, I absolutely think not. I think we should, all of us, wherever you're born, whatever your L1, accept that there is going to be an accent and it's part of our identity. And that is okay. Okay. So other challenges certainly exist, and they're listed here on screen. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we can't hide from the fact that depending on your learner's L1, there may or may not be more or less significant issues in the ability to pronounce English. It's really to do whether the sounds of English do or don't correspond with the sounds that exist in the learner's L1. If we think about some of the African clip languages, which have sounds that just don't exist in English, I'm at a real disadvantage trying to create them because I just don't know what they are. I don't know how to go about doing it. Likewise, there are the issues of limited time, limited exposure in the classroom. Plus, some students put themselves under unrealistic pressure to conform to a particular standard. That may be the impact of an education system or the teacher herself. And of course, this disputed question of the critical period hypothesis. Is it the case that as learners get older, that features of pronunciation become more difficult to achieve or not? I mean, generally speaking, I think that is true. So, pronunciation is a tricky area, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't do it or we can't enjoy it. And indeed, on that positive note, let's not forget that in the last 10 years or so, with the rise of social media, gaming, and streaming, we've got more and more opportunities for students to have exposure to the communicative aspects of their language use with friends and people they don't really even know very well if they're gaming around the world. This gives us as teachers opportunities. We can use YouTube, we can use TED.com, and we can play with some of the settings to have an impact on the availability of transcripts, subtitles, and the speed at which the recording is played, either by us, or if we show our students how to use them well, by our learners. More recently, AI has enabled voice generation, naturalreaders.com and 11labs.io, plus, of course, websites like Uglish that enable us to isolate and hear in context phrases as well as individual words. I'd always recommend phrases from social media available in UK, American, and Australian accents. So with all that in mind, if that's our background, what about a principled approach to teaching pronunciation? Now, as you'll see as we go along in this masterclass, I believe in establishing certain criteria which will enable us to assess whether an AI tool, or indeed our own traditional teaching in the classroom, is actually going to be genuinely beneficial to our learners. See this section, if you like, as my manifesto for making principled choices about the teaching and learning of pronunciation. So let's move on and think about my first principle, which is intelligibility first. Now, you will know, I'm sure, that one of the sounds in English that students, in fact, two of the sounds that students in English find very difficult are the th and the. Now, for many years, if you couldn't get these right, it was seen as a deficiency. Something was wrong in your pronunciation. But the reality is, in terms of intelligibility, if you say something like think, what do you think of that, rather than what do you think of that, that in fact, this is not going to get in the way of intelligibility. Learners communicating with one another can still understand one another. Now, it's not the case that all substitutions are permissible in terms of intelligibility. This lies at the heart of Jennifer Jenkins' work and the development of the English as a lingua franca core. And one of the things she does say is that vowel length is really important. So if we move from I to E, from ship to sheep, if our students have issues with vowel length, Spanish and Italian for example, are two languages where vowel length is less clearly distinguished, then this is going to impact on intelligibility. So I therefore think it's important that we set parameters around which sounds do and don't impact intelligibility first. And the English as a lingua franca core is, I think, really helpful for this, both in the ability to produce those sounds, but also to recognize, to distinguish them. Principle number 2, And this is something I believe passionately in. You might be wondering why there is a picture of a monkey holding a mirror, why there is a mouth showing the tongue, the lips, different parts of the mouth, and also an image showing gymnastics in the bottom right-hand corner. Well, it's my belief that we need to move way beyond listen and repeat, the kind of language learning that was happening in language laboratories in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and in some cases still today. Because just because if you listen to something and you're then encouraged to repeat it, really doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to be able to repeat it well or even intelligibly. So what we need to do is enable our learners to get their heads around the gymnastics, hence that picture, of pronunciation. For me, Adrian Underhill, I think, was one of the first people to talk about this, is that pronunciation is really about the gymnastics of the mouth. Let me give you an example from Welsh. The th sound, as in the town Llanelli, is a typical Welsh sound, but I listen and repeat it and I still couldn't get it. It wasn't until Steve Hirschhorn, another friend of gallery teachers, explained to me what my tongue should be doing, what the air should be doing coming on either side of the tongue, that I was able to both visualize, and I could look in a mirror, and I could also start to use my mouth as a gym to understand how to create the sound. And it's going to be the same for sounds in English. So we need to move beyond that listen and repeat model, using things like mirrors, using pictures of the mouth, and getting students to get involved in their gymnastics of the mouth in order to help them to create sounds better. I think also we need to just stop for one moment and start thinking about, well, which realistic standard do we want, but also do external factors need our students to work towards? So, for example, there is going to be a clear distinction made between this is a real example, a Chinese user of English who had a master's in law and was going to work for a leading London-based solicitors. And she was told in no uncertain terms that if she didn't get rid of her Chinese accent, she wouldn't be offered a job. So for her, an RP received pronunciation standard like mine wasn't really anything she could avoid. She had to try to achieve it. Whereas I actually believe the majority of learners, if we actually ask them, that having some trace of their L1 accent is okay. For many of them, it's part of their identity. So it is, I think, important that we, as classroom practitioners, have a discussion with our students about what pronunciation features matter to them, always with a mind to the exam boards that they are aiming for in terms of perhaps public exams in English, but also where are they going to be using English? Because if I'm working with a business person who is from Saudi Arabia, who does business with Germany, then I think English as a lingua franca features are much more useful than RP features. Number 4, and this is a bit of an overlap with number 3, comes back to this point about the external pressures, exam boards, plus the internal parameters which our learners find themselves under. What is their first language? So, for example, Spanish learners are unusually disadvantaged in learning the full set of English sounds, at least as far as the IPA is concerned, because many of them don't overlap with their own first language. Plus, to an extent, age. If you're teaching an adult who is starting to learn English in her 20s or 30s, then they're going to find pronunciation probably considerably more problematic in terms of even achieving intelligibility than a learner who is really young, a very young or young learner pre-puberty. So I think AI, as well as our own teaching, should consider these and, where possible, flex to them. Principle 5, you can see a cup of tea in the the right-hand side of the screen. So we might think of individual sounds here. We might look at the word cup, or is it cup, which is very popular and very common in many Northern English varieties. So are we working with cup or cup? Well, if you're working in a language school in the north of England and you have students living there, it's important that they understand that cup and cup are actually the same word. So we're looking at the vowel a and u. Likewise, we may want to consider aspects, we should consider aspects of rapid speech and intonation based on where the students are going to be using and hearing their English. Students are not going to sound natural and are going to have trouble decoding if they see the question, would you like a cup of tea, as the standard? Because even internationally, I think they're more likely to experience, would you like a cup of tea? With some of the features of fast speech, linking the sound schwa. And perhaps if they're in the UK, even, would you like a cup of tea? Which, in terms of decoding, is a very long way away from would you like. Likewise, perhaps we need to be thinking about corrective stress for meaning. So if you offer someone a cup of tea and they're really thirsty, they might want to say, oh, I'd love a mug of tea. Perhaps a little bit greedy, but you get my point. So again, in terms of a really useful AI tool, as well as a good teacher, it should be attending not just to the individual sounds, but all of these other aspects of meaning for both production and for understanding. Now, I think the other thing we need to consider, we've talked a lot so far about sounds and principles of choices around the sounds that we make, but we also need to consider what AI is currently able to do and what might happen in the future. So I was fascinated to have a look, and thank you to Lana, who is a real AI expert for this, at the rise of EVI, empathic voice interfaces. So this really looks at the way in which AI is moving away from the typical written input, which when you type something into an AI chatbot, ChatGPT, for example, very often your answer will come back as text. Or if you have got some kind of sound production, it's going to sound very robotic. Whereas EVI aims to work much more with empathic voices. It can both pick up on and produce appropriate tone and attitude, matching that aspect of attitudinal intonation in terms of meaning. And this is, I think, at the cutting edge of generative AI. And I think we'll all recognize that in many AI tools, it's just not really there yet. And then finally, because let's face it, and we've said this at the beginning of the masterclass, reality is that for many students, the number of hours of tuition they have in the classroom just isn't enough to get them to the level they want to be. They will benefit from, they will need massive exposure. And therefore, an AI tool ideally should give students that opportunity to go beyond what they hear and what they say in the classroom, to being able to listen to and practice and produce meaningful, communicative language that is intelligible in their own time. In other words, my final principle is that pronunciation work that is AI mediated is relevant for perhaps classroom use, but should take students beyond the listen and repeat model that we've seen in so many AI models so far. So this really brings us on then to the heart of the question. Hype or hope? Where do we stand with generative AI right now? Well, this is my main thesis, that a good AI tool needs to align with some of these principles for good learning and good teaching of English pronunciation. And likewise, we should avoid tech for tech's sake. It might look exciting. It may include gamification. The students might be motivated by it. But if we're only looking at a listen and repeat model, and we're going to see some examples of those, then the chances are it's not going to get them very far. So I decided to begin by asking some chatbots, some Gen AI chatbots, what are the best AI tools for helping international students with English language pronunciation? It was a relatively rough and ready prompt, and it generated some very interesting responses. I'm not going to go through each one in turn. It's not necessary. It would be rather dull for you. But you can use that same prompt, if you like, in the various chatbots that are available to you. These, by the way, chatbots based on large language models. So my first one was to ask ChatGPT. And I actually quite like what it came up with. It came up with a comprehensive list. It goes over 3 slides. But what it had in common, or in terms of the output on each of the AI tools that it recommended, was that it looks at its features, what it can do, its benefits, why it's useful, and then also uniquely, of all of the chatbots that I used, it indicated which platforms it's available on. Many of them, of course, mobile, but as we see for number 2 pronunciation power, also available on computers, both Windows and Mac. This is the second page. This is the third page. Gives us 10 ideas. And the same was true for Gemini and for Claude. And I thought, given its dominating a lot of conversation in AI at the moment, the new Chinese chatbot DeepSeek. Claude and Gemini were relatively, the amount of information they gave was basically a list with a bit of background information. ChatGPT and DeepSeek went a bit further. DeepSeek not talking about the platforms, but interestingly looking at some of the limitations that exist with the different tools that it recommended. So I didn't just trust and rely on LLMs, ChatGPT bots, to give me some ideas. I also spoke to some colleagues to find out what they're looking at. And one particular Gen AI tool that came up was ELSA. But looking at the LLM responses, a lot mentioned Duolingo. Now, I don't know why certain tools come up more than others. I'd like to think in a way that this is a bit like a word cloud, that it corresponds to the frequency with which these are talked about in the language model. So they represent a kind of a critical mass. But of course, the question there is there a critical mass for Duolingo and ELSA because they've got the biggest budgets? And I genuinely don't know, but I think it's worth asking the question, how do LLMs actually get to the point where they are producing these answers? Can we trust them, basically? I also spoke to some teachers. David Byrne, another friend of Gallery Teachers, was very helpful here, as was Lana. And David talked about some experiments that he and his teachers had been having with Capiche, Mondly, and Gliglish. So I decided to just restrict myself to ELSA and Duolingo. Are they any good? That $1 million question. So, of course, what I needed to have a meaningful decision, are they any good, was criteria. And this is where I went back to some of the principles that I shared with you in the second part of the masterclass. But I also wanted to add one at the end around affordability. And also the fact, is it blinding us with pseudoscience? So, for example, if we're getting acoustic waves on screen, Do you know, do your students know how to interpret an acoustic wave? I mean, I don't really. So in that respect, I think if they're giving us pseudoscience, it's not really worth it that that particular feature isn't a benefit because we don't know what the acoustic wave is trying to tell us, or indeed if it's even accurate. So for me, I wanted apps to focus on intelligibility as much as, or indeed more than just accuracy. In other words, was what I said intelligible or not? Does it go beyond the listen and repeat model? What standard does it use? If the majority of users of English around the world are using English to speak to other non-native speakers of English, I don't think a native model is necessarily particularly helpful. Are its goals achievable? Does it only work with individual sounds? Sound discrimination, ship, sheep, for example? Or does it go beyond to the suprasegmental? Can it work with attitudinal aspects? And here I'm really pushing the barriers of generative AI pronunciation tools. And this is what I discovered. Well, I started with Duolingo, and my main experience of Duolingo is via working with learning Welsh, which of course is not particularly relevant to any of us. But what I can say about the Welsh version of Duolingo is all it does is it plays me some rapid Welsh, fast speech, which I can't understand. It doesn't give me any tools to decode it other than a play slowly. And then I can try and discern what it is I've heard, and then I put the sentence back together again. So I decided to try a Duolingo for English, and because I'm a fluent Italian speaker, I chose Duolingo English for Italian speakers. The instructions were all in Italian, and it then came up with an American model. So I tried to make it go wrong. So if it asked me to repeat a sentence, I would put in incorrect vowel lengths. If it asked me to say, where is the ship? Okay, where is the sheep? And quite often it would actually vote me as correct. Odd. It might highlight the word ship as being not quite right, but overall it said I was intelligible. It gave me the mark. Clearly, this is not working with intelligibility or indeed accuracy. It doesn't go beyond listen and repeat, the English version for Italians. And it has this fixed American English model. And let me just warn you here in terms of American English, I'm not quite sure even which American English it is. Its goals, well, it seems to be aligned to the CEFR, but when I asked it to sort of tell me more, it couldn't, and I couldn't find any real linkage to what its goals were. So all in all, I didn't feel that Duolingo was particularly helpful. So I then went to ELSA, which a lot of people are very excited about. But again, it did on occasions accept in English some unintelligible words. So I substituted student for estudianti, which blends a bit of Spanish, quote unquote, mispronunciation with morphological, the I showing plural from Italian, and clearly isn't the word student, but it still accepted it as correct. I'm not intelligible. If I say to the average person, oh, how many estudianti are there? They're not going to know what I'm talking about. It did give me feedback on tone, but it told me that my tone was wrong when actually I was using my normal everyday tone, which kind of perplexed me. It corrected me when it didn't need to. And again, it seemed to be based on a native American model. It is more goal aligned and nominally CEFR aligned than Duolingo. When I was setting it up, it asked me my level. It tested me. It told me I was C1, lower advanced in English. But when I then asked it if it could help me with aspects of pronunciation that exist below the C1 level, corrective stress, for example, it told me that this was above the C1 level, which I thought was rather odd. It gave me feedback on tone, which is good. But it also told me that I was wrong, that I sounded too passive when I was trying to correct someone. But at least it was attending to both individual sounds and stretches of sound, but again, inaccurately. So, in brief, AI right now, as far as the main apps are concerned, does seem to be more hype than it is hope. But then I came across this article, ChatGPT for L2 pronunciation, teaching and learning. What I thought was really interesting is that ChatGPT itself didn't recognize ChatGPT as a tool for working on pronunciation. This appears in the English Language Teaching Journal. Some of you will have access to it. Unfortunately, it is behind a subscription or wall. It's not open source at this point. But what I've tried to do over the next 2 pages is summarize the findings. This page looks at some of the positives of ChatGPT. And I think the key one for me was the fact it's much more flexible as a pronunciation tool than any of the AI apps. You can, once you know, and this is a limitation, once you know how to prompt, you can get it to develop very tailored activities relating to both production, but also to listening, to decoding. You can ask it to provide contextualized activities, not just random words, but put them into a meaningful context, potentially something that the students have previously studied. You can ask it to work on specific vowels and consonants, minimal pairs. Is that a ship or is it a sheep? But also, according to Mompian's research, it can effectively work with aspects of suprasegmental fast speech, linking, elision, assimilation. Likewise, other positives, unlike, for example, ELSA, it's able to work with lexical stress correction, a record versus verb record. You can enable it to practice weak forms. And as I say, it does help with sound recognition and discrimination, that dual purpose role that pronunciation now has. And there is a little bit of variety in terms of asking it to work with British, American, and Australian English. It's not all good news, of course. Like any prompt and any response to a prompt, ChatGPT requires skills for writing good prompts. So if you want our students to use this in their own time, we need to teach them how to write effective prompts. But also we need our students, we need to be aware ourselves that ChatGPT does hallucinate, and therefore we need to have the ability to check and edit the output, something that our students will struggle with. When you ask ChatGPT to tell you about pronunciation, when would I expect to use weak forms in English? So know about rather than know how, it pitches language very high. And sometimes in its responses, going back to the point about editing, it gives very unexpected results. So if you're asking ChatGPT to generate some statements for you containing the weak form the, where's Pierre? He's at the supermarket. He's at the hairdressers, whatever. It actually, when it produced the example sentences, it got rid of the A and it put an apostrophe in its place. It just didn't look like English. And it does seem as a default to work to a native model, something which I find problematic. Another aspect is that, again, if we believe, and this is true of all of the AI apps as well, that if pronunciation is more than listen, repeat, and we want to be able to see, to have a picture of what our mouth is doing in the production of certain sounds, currently it's limited, it can't do that. We also need to consider that ChatGPT responds to a response in real time. Yes, but using its LLM. It doesn't think. It's using its database to give the best match to the question, but it's not like a teacher able to provide real-time individualized feedback. So I think at best it's useful. I'm getting onto the hype or hope now. And it's a complementary tool. It's not a dedicated tool. But interestingly, although it's a complementary tool, it does other things as well. It actually does them rather better than some of the AI tools that are promoted as pronunciation tools. Although, I'll say it again, it can be challenging for self-study use. So in conclusion, hype or hope? Let me just reiterate from the earlier parts of today's masterclass that I think pronunciation is complex, it's very personal, and it's to do with not just the sound production, but also the ability to understand, to decode when we listen. We want AI tools, or at least I do, and I think we should all aspire to wanting an AI tool that goes beyond a native model of pronunciation, be it American, Australian, or British English, and which very definitely goes beyond listen and repeat. Now, unfortunately, currently, many of the phone-based AI tools, which either claim to focus on pronunciation or in reality, like the majority, have pronunciation as one aspect of their wider language learning setup. Duolingo, for example. Duolingo is not a pronunciation app, it's a language learning app. They're pretty limited, and they tend to be limited to individual sounds at a segmental level, again linked to the native model. So I actually, at the moment, favor more ChatGPT as a more flexible tool for helping learners, teachers with pronunciation for inside and outside the classroom, but with that caveat that it does hallucinate and it requires training for us as teachers and for our students to be able to get the most from it. So currently, my answer is this, that in terms of hype and hope, generative AI is predominantly more hype, but I think with the speed of development, perhaps we can look forward to a future, probably sooner than we realize, where the balance between the hype and the hope begins to even out. I should just add to my fifth point here, I've looked at what ChatGPT can do. Some really useful follow-up would be looking at Claude, would be looking at DeepSeek and Gemini Copilot, some of those main ChatGPT large language models, to compare what they do with what ChatGPT does according to the research. Here are some useful links which relate to, for example, the physicality of teaching pronunciation. That's the Adrian Underhill book, Sound Foundations, and also the video, the second link. Hancock MacDonald, Matt Hancock, is doing some really interesting work in teacher training for teachers of pronunciation, but also that really interesting article, ChatGPT for L2 pronunciation, teaching and learning. I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. I hope it's given you insights into why I believe that it's more hype than hope for now. You may disagree. I'd love to find out more. But this particular masterclass sits in, together with a whole library of masterclasses on a whole range of topics, some on AI, but many not, that are available if you take out Pro membership with TEFL. Thanks very much indeed, and I now really look forward to the discussion that we'll be having together with our panelists. Thank you.